On today's episode, we have Steve Weyler, the lead federal lobbyist at Invariant. Steve leads the firm's sports advisory arm and has represented IMG Academy with their Add More Athletes campaign, and Cody Campbell's Save College Sports, which is currently lobbying on college sports reform. We get his thoughts on the Let Kids Play Act and the evolving landscape of youth sports policy in Washington, which is currently targeting private equity involvement, affordability, and safety standards. But before we get into the episode, we also want to thank our sponsors, especially Event Connect, who continue to power this show and allow us to show up in your inboxes. So now let's get into the episode with Steve. Stephen Weyler, Senior Director at Invariant. I appreciate you coming on Buying Sandlot at the summit. You said youth sports is on the menu, and you couldn't have been more right. Every week since we've heard multiple politicians comment on youth sports, from cost to policy. I know you're plugged into what's going on in Washington. We just have a new bill that might be on the table coming up, the Let Kids Play Act. Can you talk to us anything about, what you've learned so far, what you're hearing there, anything you can offer on it for us?
Sure. Happy to be here. You all crushed the conference, and it was a great panel to be a part of. I think it is the continuation of exactly what we talked about, which is Washington is paying attention, and they're paying attention now in a very real way to youth sports. What we talked about at the conference was the perception around youth sports is that it's more expensive, it's commercialized, and at least to some policymakers, private equity is to blame or perhaps part of the blame. And as you mentioned, there's been public reporting around the Let Kids Play Act. And I will say I've not seen text, and I've heard that the bill is imminent in the next few weeks. And I think the devil will be in the details for what this bill says. But to me, as I look across kind of the work that's been set out, we see three policymakers in particular, Congressman DeLuzio and Senators Murphy and Booker, who have been setting the groundwork. We saw a field hearing with Congressman DeLuzio in Pittsburgh, and then we've seen multiple social media posts or speeches from the senators talking about affordability being a root cause of some of the challenges we're seeing across the youth sports industry. And as I understand it, the Let Kids Play Act will be a direct response to what these lawmakers believe is the challenge in youth sports. And in their heads, that's private equity.
Yeah, it's got, I think they previewed it in one of these viral videos last week, and there was kind of three major, very broad tenets, one being ban private equity, two being end state-of-play practices around tournaments, and then three, diverting money back to communities, which is, obviously very unspecific. Maybe just kind of go through each of those in general. I understand you haven't read the detail, but where do you think some of those ideas are likely to take root? And frankly, what is the feasibility of some of the, of banning private equity in youth sports? What's the mechanism by which that could even be done in Washington?
Sure. Feasibility, it's an uphill battle. It's an uphill battle for sure. But I will say this is one of those unique issue areas where right now the three members that have been talked about with this bill are all Democratic members, but there are Republicans that have expressed concern with private equity's involvement in a whole host of different issue areas. I think banning, so to speak, private equity will be a hard battle. But I think, as I mentioned, the devil be in the details. I think the definition section is the key piece here for what these lawmakers are truly going after here. They talk about banning private equity. What does that mean? Does that mean anyone investing in youth sports? Or are these the really big players that are focused on the quote unquote roll-up strategies that they've talked about in these field hearings? Is it the smaller private equity firms? I think the definition section will be absolutely critical to see, at least in my opinion, who these lawmakers view as the perceived bad guys in the youth sports space versus perhaps the ones that are investing in meaningful ways. I think the investments in the local communities is a really interesting one. How are they going to go about that? Is there going to be a requirement that these private equity companies are going to have to reinvest in the community? Again, I think it's really important to see the details. I think there's absolutely a place for federal funding to play a role here. Are they investing through earmarks in federal appropriations down to these rec leagues? The thing that I've heard around this bill and with the documentary that was put out is youth sports need to get back to the way they were. And I think the way they were in a lot of these policymakers' head is rec driven, local driven, nonprofit driven. So what we've heard through the video is these leagues are struggling and they're budget strapped, they're strapped for cash. So I can imagine a world in which there's some type of funding mechanism, either through the federal government or through an reinvestment per se, that would fund money back into the groups that are perceived to be struggling and ones that are perceived to be how youth sports used to operate. I think that is perhaps a more digestible place to start for a lot of people, but I think it's an uphill battle. If you ask the policymakers whether they think this will become law, it would be an interesting answer, and I'd be very curious to see what they have to say. I look at this and I think it's a really good political messaging strategy.
I have lots of thoughts, which I won't really get into here on, the way things used to be. I think people tend to remember the nostalgic part and not remember that, you needed a tetanus shot before you sat on the bench, right? I remember some fields we played at in the 90s. But is there a specific argument here around antitrust, or is it something else when it comes to private equity? Like, what is the very specific thing that Washington's likely to key on?
There is. And I would point you to the participants in the field hearing and the participants of the documentary video that was just released. I mentioned it in the panel, but Katie Van Dyke is very intimately involved in these conversations. She was a witness at Congressman DeLuzio's field hearing. She was a participant in this video. And she just released, not too long ago, a report on private equity's involvement in youth sports. And Katie Van Dyke is an antitrust attorney, a very good antitrust attorney that's most well known for her lawsuit against Varsity Brands. She was a Biden administration attorney, and she's been playing a more vocal role in these conversations and the strategy that she has taken. And if you look in her report to Congress via her testimony in December, she was also a witness at the Education and Workforce hearing in December. And then if you look at the report that she just published a few weeks back with her group, they identify antitrust and antitrust strategies as the way to go about this bill. And to me, what's fascinating about this is she actually likens private equity's involvement in youth sports in a very similar way to what we're seeing in healthcare, which is a very, very interesting strategic decision that this is a bigger conversation than just youth sports. This is part of a broader conversation around antitrust and monopolistic practices where groups are perceived to be buying up the whole ecosystem, horizontally and vertically integrated. And that's the piece we're seeing really come through in how the bill's being talked about, how the report's being talked about, and I think the direction the bill will ultimately go in.
Maybe steelman that argument, that analogy between healthcare. What exactly is it, and how does it relate to youth sports? Because I think for the average person, frankly myself included, is when you hear antitrust in youth sports, the other thing we always hear, and is true in youth sports, is how fragmented it is. So like, I think there's like a cognitive dissonance there. And it's like, how can you have antitrust argument in such a highly fragmented market? Walk us through what that argument looks like.
Sure. I think the way it's being framed is it is a highly fragmented environment, which can lead to consolidation. And that's the word we continue to see, consolidation. It's easy to roll up these different fragmented entities into a very neatly arranged top-down approach to youth sports. I think we've seen this with tournaments, with leagues, with owning the facilities. So where these lawmakers and where Katie has zeroed in on are these companies or entities that perhaps own the entire spectrum of that sport. They own the rink, or they own the field, they own the track, they own the uniform, they own the streaming service, and they own pretty much end to end what that sport needs to exist. And that's what they're keying in on. So it can be fragmented, but in their vision, it can be rolled up. There's a really interesting, I'll use a Washington CRS report. So the Congressional Research Services just released a report 2 days ago, actually. And they release reports when members of Congress are interested. And it's a CRS report on, I'll give you the exact title, Private Equity in Selected Industries, a Policy Background. And they talk about this exact issue, the roll-up, the integration, and owning end-to-end. And I'll tell you the industries that they talk about are healthcare, family housing, childcare, utilities, higher ed, insurance, banking, and youth sports. If I'm a youth sports operator, or if I'm a PE-backed youth sports operator, that's not necessarily the list of entities I want to be grouped in with for Washington's purposes.
Murderer's Row right there, you just named.
So the argument's basically, you may be able to exist as a baseball player over here, but if you get into that, just pick a random sport like the hockey funnel, all of a sudden now you're controlled by largely by a single entity that controls your participation, your travel, your streaming, your registration.
To me, that's what they're keying in on, and that's the thing that they're most concerned about.
Stephen, do you think why youth sports is, we talk about it, 60 billion, 80 billion, whatever it is, it's ain't anywhere close to tech, it ain't anywhere close to banking, it ain't anywhere close to healthcare in terms of market size. But I think you alluded to this on the panel, is the reason why this is getting so much, people are paying in Washington so much attention to it, is because their constituents are directly affected by this. And we saw this with the PA House right now is going through this with high school basketball, separating private and public state playoffs. Once families wrote into these congressmen, what happened? A bill got written up, they passed it through the House, and it's waiting on the Senate right now. Is that what you're seeing? It's because they know these people are voting for them in 2026 and in 2028?
As a Philadelphia Catholic League school guy, it would pain my heart to not compete for a PIAA championship against all 100%. Schools, but I do not have a dog in that fight.
I got two Catholic League guys here, don't I?
Yeah. Hell yeah.
That's you hit the nail on the head. When I talked about at the panel affordability being the political word, that is ringing true. Affordability is going to continue to be the word of the day through November. Republicans and Democrats are going to use it. And I warned folks at the conference, affordability is not going to stay at the gas pump or the grocery store. This bill and this potential introduction of this bill highlights it not staying at the gas pump or the grocery store. And one of the things that I heard in my conversations on the Hill about this is there are a lot of problems in the world, and there are a lot of challenges to talk about. So how do you pick the challenge to talk about? Gas is one of those big items, but the problems with gas are quite literally a world away to most people. The issues that voters care about are ones that touch their life every single day. Right, wrong, or indifferent, the cost of youth sports is one that touches their life every single day. And I can promise you, congressional offices are hearing about this. They are hearing about it because the people in their district are seeing the cost of their children's participation in a sport go up. So when you have that very concrete and real connection to an issue around a politically important one, it's one that we will continue to see politicians talk about. So while this is probably the first real attempt to legislate affordability, it most definitely will not be the last.
I've heard you've talked about perception and narrative shaping policy, in general in Washington. Um, do you, what do you, you've outlaid the narrative, right? How, maybe, what are some of the facts that could counter that narrative? Or if you were like, how could the industry, let me phrase it this way, how could the industry, what narrative could the industry tell to say, hey, like, yes, there's problems here, but some of the narrative as presented is inaccurate, or here's our view of it? What's the winning message for youth sports industry, whether that's private equity or larger tech platforms or things like that?
To me, it's telling an authentic story about your company and really why you care and why you're in the industry. The perception is you're in the industry to make money. If you can tell members of Congress, I'm in this industry because I played sports, I played college sports, I played professional sports, and I'm the reason I am today because of those things, that's a door opener, I think. And you talk about data. I think data is a hugely important part of this story. One of the initiatives underway, both on the private sector, nonprofit, and government side, is the idea around increasing participation in youth sports. 63 by 30 is something that we've heard from all of those entities. How can those companies in the industry talk about the increase in participation rates at the youth sports level? They dipped tremendously during COVID. We're seeing them start to rebound. Are you a part of that story? If you're not telling that story and you're not sharing that data, then there's going to be a void there. And I can promise you the void that is being filled right now are from the grassroots, from the locals, from the rec leagues, who are talking in a very meaningful way, in a very persuasive way, about the affordability cost. And if I was just sitting back calling balls and strikes, I think, to me, those groups are winning the narrative battle. And I talked about it at the panel. Perception drives policy. And if the perception is it's too expensive, we're too expensive for certain populations, and kids are falling out of sports because of the cost, and there's no rebuttal to that showing, no, actually, look at the participation rates, look at the cost of tournaments since we've been involved, then the only narrative that's going to take hold is the one that's talking about the cost.
So if P's down a couple touchdowns right now, should we see the offense? The offense is getting on the field. They're running shotgun formation, and they're going to try to go on the offense now and score.
That's a really good way to put it. That's a really good way to put it. And truthfully, yes, I think a lot of companies, and this is across industries, there is a perceived risk with engaging in Washington. And when I say engaging in Washington, I mean telling your story, talking to lawmakers, really figuring out where there could be challenges but opportunities. I think there's a perceived risk that will that put the spotlight on me even more? And I can tell you, at least from my own personal experience, the biggest risk is not engaging, because if no one's telling your story, only the competition is telling your story, and you will always be on defense. And to come back to that analogy, if you're always on defense, chances are you are not going to come back those multiple touchdowns.
Defense doesn't win championships in this analogy.
It does not. It does not.
Yeah, I know there's a I think a competing bill floating around out there that may come to fruition, which I think is focusing on the benefits of participation, and even potentially will lean into, hey, like, we need military age people, and sports is a great way for people to be healthy, get off the couch, not be obese, things like that, which will help tell the participation story potentially. If there, with any sort of regulation, or even maybe just the threat of some sort of regulation or policy, people always benefit in any industry. Who in youth sports, which areas of the space are likely to benefit, or be in a good spot to capitalize on, a bill getting passed?
Guess it depends which way you look at it. If you're taking the local rec side, and there's a bill that perhaps bans private equity's involvement in the space, then there will be a pretty significant gap to fill, because we know that private equity investments have really transformed over the last 5-6 years the way the youth sports market looks. So I think from their perspective, there's a significant market opportunity then. Do they have the funds to do that? Do they have the bandwidth? All open questions. If you're on the flip side and you're looking on the PE side, then I think the challenge right now and the opportunity is to go to Capitol Hill and say, here's how we're making youth sports better. Here's why a blanket ban on all private equity investment does not solve any problems. Here are the challenges it creates. Here's what the landscape looks like. There is no quote unquote going back. It just looks different. We're filling what the market told us to fill. So I think it depends on which side of the fence you're looking at. One group or perhaps set of groups that I think is really set to gain in all of this are the safety focused, the insurance focused, minded companies in this space. One of the areas that we've seen take hold, both sides of this, is the growing injury concerns with youth athletes, ACL tears, Tommy John surgeries, the really fragmented approach states have taken to concussions. There are groups and companies in the youth sports market that touch all of those issue areas. And I think whether you're on the PE or let's call it local rec side, that is the nice in-between mediator type place to be, because the safety is paramount. The safety is one that I can assure you will get bipartisan support. So from the really benefit side, I think those are groups that can weigh in and take advantage of this opportunity the most.
Yeah, everyone agrees that health safety standards, that's, an easy and an obvious and the right one in many ways. Does, on that front though, if you have increased, you've probably seen this in other spaces, but if you have increased requirements, right? And hey, every coach needs to be background checked. There needs to be a trainer available for concussion tests, right? Like inherently, doesn't that contribute to the cost? Like how does Washington square those things? You have more regulation, but somebody, money changes hands to get those standards up to a certain spot. And now someone has to further subsidize the cost.
You're 100% right. And that would be absolutely part of the conversation. I think some camps would say that's the federal government's job to subsidize or support. Other groups would probably feel differently, but it's $1 million question. I think it's one of those policy trade-offs. If we increase safety, is it worth the extra $10 for that camp? And I think that's a question perhaps for the market, but also a question for, where does the federal government feel like they can intervene in the most helpful way? But it's a great question that I think policymakers would definitely wrestle with.
Yeah. I mean, it goes along with state of play too. I think it goes in that same fold where it's like and I don't know if I really agree with state of play, but if it does, they do prohibit it, then do tournament fees go up? Do other fees go up? Who gets those fees passed on to? The parents get it passed on to. So it feels like we're kind of in this continuous tug of war, to continue my sports analogies for this podcast interview.
I like a continuous tug of war, and that's what Washington is good at. On the state of play piece, I will say I've heard a lot about this particular piece of the private equity conversation. And this is what lawmakers are hearing from parents the most. In my travels, that is one thing that's been pointed to more than most, which is, I'm holding a tournament, or there's a tournament that we have to get our children to, and we either can't participate if we don't stay in this hotel, or we have to go to this hotel to be with the team. So I do think that's one area in particular that if I had to pick one piece of this pie that lawmakers will really zero in on, that's one that they hear the most about.
Yeah, you're even currently, I think, seeing the branding of state of play change. We had someone on a couple of weeks ago, and it's stay to save, right? And they're trying to, hey, you save 10% if you book through this way. But if nothing else, the branding is trying to change before the law, I guess, on that one. if there is, I mean, you said there's a lot of, last one for me on this. You said there's a lot of there is obviously a lot of bipartisan support around kids and cost for sports, and certainly health and safety standards. Is there somewhere where Democrats and Republicans, outside of maybe like the general anti-PE take, like is there somewhere Democrats and Republicans are not aligned here, where you're going to see pushback on one side versus the other side?
I think it's the approach that they ultimately take. And, I keep reciting this, but the devil will be in the details for how Congressman DeLuzio and Senators Murphy and Booker go about this bill. We've heard pushback from Republicans and Democrats alike on PE's involvement. Their approaches may look vastly different. So I think that's one area that we will see continue, and that will be iterated multiple times. I would say, generally speaking, the Republican conservative side is more reluctant to use the federal government heavy-handed approach. The Democratic side, dissimilar, where they will try to use the federal government to, say, ban private equity's involvement of the space. So perhaps thematically they agree, but getting to the finish line on what that looks like will look vastly different. And that's really, as I see it, the process that will play out here over the next 6 months, year, and beyond.
Do you expect something will get passed, call it between now and 2028? Like if you had to assign a probability?
I wish I could look into my crystal ball.
Be a very valuable crystal ball.
It would be a valuable crystal ball.
That'd be great for some prediction markets. I know that.
It would be really good for some prediction markets. I think November will be determinative of what is feasible. If history is our guide, generally speaking, the midterm election isn't favorable to the incumbent president. If polls are indicative of where things go, it looks right now like it could flip. The Senate is very much a toss-up. So I think November will be a really determinative guide in where things move from here. I wouldn't be surprised if we see college sports pass at some point in the near future. Hopefully it's not 2028, but that's one item that I'm looking at. I think sports betting is on that list. So there are conversations all around sport. And as youth sports becomes more on affordability, commercialization, and really likened to these professional leagues or perhaps more professionalized industries, I can guarantee you it will be part of the conversation.
On the sports betting piece, there's been some ideas around taking some sort of an excise tax on sports betting revenues and then using that to subsidize some initiatives in youth sports. Is that practical, or does that have to happen at the state level because it's so heavily regulated by state?
I think it's a combination of both. We're seeing it more at the state level. The states are the ones passing the sports gambling bills, and we actually frequently see a cut go to either education or otherwise. Youth sports have been a part of that conversation.
Tougher at the federal level?
It would be tougher and almost a novel concept at the federal level, but the money from sports gambling has been identified by other groups. For example, the National Center for Problem Gambling. The problem gambling groups really want to get a piece of that money. So I think there will be a competition in that space for, if there is a federal excise tax on sports gambling, who does it go to? But I will say it is an idea that is gaining traction.
Piggybacking off that question, do you think this let kids play act, do you think it would be better if it was suited at the state level, or do you think it should be at the federal level?
That's an interesting question, and I think it'll depend on what it says.
Yeah, true. The devil's in the details.
Unfortunately,
I'm a good listener. It's all good.
The devil is in the details, and until we see exactly who they're going after and exactly the reinvestment strategy, if we're to believe the video as the direction, I think it'll be really, really interesting a post conversation once that bill is introduced.
I got one for you on add more athletes.
Let's do it.
obviously the campaign is spearheaded by IMG. Anyone that doesn't know, they want colleges to sponsor more than one athletic team per sport. Just want to kind of get your thoughts on the recent headlines of schools cutting non-revenue Olympic sports. Rutgers claims they're $500 million in the hole since joining the Big Ten. Just seeing these headlines, what's your thoughts on add more athletes now from a position, and what's your messaging to schools who are working with an uncertain future when you guys want to add more athletes over there?
On the headlines, it's unfortunate. It really, really is tough to see programs be cut. I was a college athlete. I was a football player at Villanova, and I know what being a college athlete did for me, both in college but beyond. And I think part of the conversation that IMG has and wants to raise awareness about is parents want their kids to compete in college, not just for the degree, but the life skills that it brings. And I am a walking example of the life skills that college sports instills. So to know that certain programs are cutting athletic teams and those athletes either currently there or who were slotted to be there will not have that opportunity is really unfortunate. And I think it gets to why add more athletes is so critically important. College sports are really they're in a tough place right now. Every time the NCAA tries to come down with a regulation, they're sued. So it's being called the Wild West. The unfortunate piece here is women's sports and Olympic sports, the non-revenue sports, are often the first ones on the chopping blocks. So these big schools in particular can fund their football and basketball programs. And the big challenge here is we have a pretty significant supply and demand problem when it comes to college sports. 500,000 college roster spots, 8 million high school athletes competing for those roster spots. Throw in the transfer portal, compounding some of these challenges, it's becoming more challenging to compete in college. So IMG's come up with this solution where athletic programs can sponsor more than one team per sport if they have the demand, the interest, and the resources, so that we can expand the number of athletes competing in college who then get the education, the life skills that come with it, while hopefully also fixing some of the downstream problems with, I think part of the affordability piece here is parents are willing to do whatever to get their kids to compete in college. Yeah. If we let the pressure out just even a little bit, hopefully some of those downstream implications will be felt.
Classic supply and demand, right? You get tons of demand, very little supply.
Correct.
Interesting stuff.
No, this is great. No, we appreciate you coming on, talking more about this. I mean, even the big guys talking about youth sports right now. Did you see the presidential fitness test is back?
Presidential fitness test is back. Those were my favorite days at Cardinal O'Hara.
God, Kyle's got terrible.
I was a white badge
he's
guy.
Got terrible quick twitch. So you want?
What were you? Did you do it? Did they do it in the Interact?
Was it a thing? I never even heard.
It's a Catholic school thing.
Never heard of this in the Interact.
Philly Catholic League.
No.
Were you strike me as an overachiever? You're a blue badge guy. If I knew.
It was my Super Bowl. It was
so
my
anyone
Super Bowl and
Kyle, for anyone else that doesn't know out there, blue was the best. That's when you hit like 99 percentile. 75 to 50 percentile was a red badge. And then guys like me who were too cool for school and didn't want to run the mile and just walked it, because again, being too cool for school, we got the white badge. We were the coolest kids in the school. So.
Fortunately for me, I ran track my freshman year, so I had the running part down, and then I was a kicker and punter, so the flexibility piece was always a secret weapon of mine.
I used to wake up in a cold sweat when the morning of the V-sit reach. Oh.
See, the problem though, and I love Cardinal O'Hara, but we did not have air conditioning. So after treating that like my Olympic Games and my Super Bowl and going all out, I felt bad for the classmates that were anywhere near me because there was no cooling off.
I hear you. No, it's great. I'm so glad that there's going to be a new generation of kids that are going to be able to talk about the presidential fitness test 30 years from now. So, but Stephen, we appreciate you coming on. We appreciate you. I hope you might be. I don't want to put an official title, but you might be the go-to legislative guy for all these acts and these bills that are going to come down the pike. So I hope you clear your schedule for buying Sandlot sometime.
That's what I'm here for. I care a lot about this subject, so happy to be a resource for buying Sandlot.
I appreciate that. All right.
Thanks for coming on, man.